The real story. Horror. Only. At Mr. Scare.
When I first moved into the neighborhood, it seemed peaceful, the kind of place where everyone knows each other. My house was a small rental at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by neatly trimmed lawns and friendly faces. Everyone was welcoming, except for Mrs. Abernathy. Her house sat directly next to mine, a crumbling two-story Victorian shrouded by overgrown hedges and ivy. The paint was peeling, the windows were always shuttered, and the mailbox leaned awkwardly as if it might topple over. The neighborhood kids whispered about her, calling her the witch. I didn't believe them at first, but then I saw her. She was old, ancient really, thin as a twig, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to see through you. Her hair was a wild tangle of silver, and her face was deeply lined, as if it had been carved from stone. I only saw her at night, standing on her porch, staring into the streetlight with a faraway look. She never spoke, never waved, and never came outside during the day. At first, I wrote her off as an eccentric recluse, but then the strange things started happening. It began with the sounds. Late at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I'd hear a faint scraping noise, like nails against wood. It always seemed to come from her direction. Then, there were the shadows. From my upstairs window, I could see flickering lights moving behind the shutters of her house, as though she were pacing the rooms with a candle. One night, I heard what sounded like a low moan carried on the wind. I told myself it was just the wind, but it didn't stop. It grew louder, more guttural, until it sounded like someone, or something, was in pain. I told the neighbors about it, but they brushed me off.
Just Mrs. Abernathy.
Mr. Cole from across the street said.
She's harmless.
But harmless people don't bury things in their backyard at 3 in the morning. I saw her one night through the gap in the hedge. She was out there with a small shovel, digging a hole under the pale moonlight. Her movements were deliberate, her wiry frame illuminated by the dim glow of her porch light. After a few minutes, she pulled something out of her pocket, a small bundle wrapped in cloth, and placed it into the hole. She covered it quickly, muttering something under her breath, then shuffled back inside. The next morning, I couldn't resist. I grabbed my own shovel and sneaked into her yard. The ground was freshly turned, and it didn't take long to find the bundle. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it, half expecting to find something horrific. It was a dead bird, its feathers slick with blood. I dropped it and ran back to my house, my heart pounding. What kind of person buries dead animals in their backyard? What was she doing with them? The next few weeks were worse. Packages began arriving at her house, heavy boxes wrapped in brown paper with no return address. I watched as the delivery man struggled to haul them to her porch. She didn't come out to greet him. Instead, she waited until nightfall to drag them inside. I saw the contents of one by accident. The side of a box had torn, and as the delivery man carried it, something spilled out. Dozens of sharp metal objects. They clattered onto the pavement with a metallic ring. Knives, blades, tools I couldn't even name. He hurriedly shoved them back into the box, avoiding my eyes. What was she doing with all of this? My imagination ran wild. Was she building something? Conducting some kind of ritual? One night, the sounds from her house changed. Instead of the usual scraping, I heard whispers, low, frantic, and overlapping. I pressed my ear to the wall, straining to make out the words, but they were unintelligible. Then there was a crash, followed by a blood-curdling scream. I called the police. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was fear. Something was happening in that house, something dark. When they arrived, Mrs. Abernathy opened the door, calm as ever. She answered their questions politely, her frail voice steady. They didn't find anything. No strange devices, no signs of struggle, nothing to explain the noise. They left, and she stared at me through the window as they drove away. The breaking point came the following week. I woke up to a loud knock on my door. It was past midnight, and my heart raced as I stumbled downstairs. When I opened the door, no one was there. But on the porch was a box, a plain, unmarked box. I looked around, but the street was empty. I carried it inside and opened it carefully. Inside was a single object, a small hand-carved wooden figure of a man. Its features were crude, but its expression was unmistakable. Fear. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening in that house. I waited until nightfall, then slipped through the hedge and tried the back door. It was unlocked. The inside of the house was as strange as I'd imagined. The air was heavy, the walls covered in strange symbols carved into the wood. Shelves lined with jars of herbs, bones, and unrecognizable objects filled the rooms. The flickering lights I'd seen. They were candles, arranged in intricate patterns on the floors. But then I saw the drawings, dozens of them, scattered across a table. They were crude sketches of me, standing at my window, walking to my car, sitting on my porch. My blood ran cold. She'd been watching me. I turned to leave, but I froze. Mrs. Abernathy was standing in the doorway, her gray eyes fixed on me.
"You shouldn't be here,"
she said quietly. I started to stammer an apology, but she raised a hand to silence me.
"You think I'm a monster, don't you?
She said, her voice trembling.
But you don't understand. I've been trying to protect you."
"Protect me?" I asked, my voice shaking. She gestured to the table.
"The thing watching you isn't me. It's been following you since you moved in. I've been keeping it at bay, but it's growing stronger."
I didn't believe her. How could I? But then she pulled a mirror from the shelf and held it up to me. There was something behind me. A shadowy figure, tall and thin, with glowing eyes. It vanished the moment I turned around, but my reflection remained frozen, its mouth open in a silent scream. Mrs. Abernathy saved me that night. She used the tools and symbols I'd thought were sinister to banish whatever had attached itself to me. She explained everything, how she'd noticed it following me, how she'd buried charms in her yard to protect me, how she'd tried to ward it off with her rituals. I apologized. I thanked her, and for the first time, I saw her smile. The next day, her house was quiet again, and the shadows were gone. And now every night, I leave a light on for her, just in case she's still watching. When the Johnsons moved in next door, they were quiet and kept to themselves. Their house had been on the market for years, a sprawling Victorian-style place that loomed over the neighborhood like a forgotten relic. I'd always thought it was too big for just two people, but the Johnsons seemed perfectly content to live there alone. Then one evening, Mrs. Johnson knocked on my door, her face pale and strained.
"Can you help me with something?"
she asked. Her voice was soft, almost trembling. I was surprised. She'd never spoken more than a polite hello to me before, but I nodded. "Of course, what's wrong?"
"It's my husband,"
she said.
"I can't find him."
The request was strange, but her distress was genuine, so I followed her back to the house. It was my first time inside, and the moment I stepped through the door, I felt it, an oppressive weight in the air, like the house itself was alive. The dim lighting and heavy curtains made everything feel darker than it should have been. "Where did you last see him?" I asked.
"In the study.
She said, pointing down a long hallway.
But when I went to check, he wasn't there. I've looked everywhere."
The hallway felt strangely elongated, its dim lighting exaggerating every shadow. The house had always appeared modest from the outside, yet inside, the air carried a musty, aged scent, like old wood and forgotten corners left undisturbed for years. I tried to shake off the unease. "All right, let's start with the study." The study was at the end of the hall, a large room lined with bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. Papers and books were scattered across the desk, as if Mr. Johnson had left in a hurry. A lamp flickered weakly in the corner. As I scanned the room, something caught my eye. A door I hadn't noticed before. It was small, almost hidden between two shelves. "Did you check here?" I asked. Mrs. Johnson frowned.
That door wasn't there before.
Her words sent a chill down my spine. But before I could respond, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward.
Maybe he went down there.
She said, though her voice quivered with doubt. Against my better judgment, I led the way. The staircase seemed endless, descending far below what should have been the foundation of the house. The air grew colder, the walls damp and covered in strange, spiraling symbols carved into the stone. The deeper we went, the louder the sound of faint whispers became, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. Finally, we reached the bottom, stepping into a cavernous room lit by a strange, dim glow that seemed to come from nowhere. The walls were lined with more symbols, and in the center of the room stood a massive mirror. It wasn't like any mirror I'd ever seen. The glass was dark, almost black, and the frame was twisted, as though it had been forged from molten metal and left to cool in a chaotic shape. I turned to Mrs. Johnson, but she was staring at the mirror, her face pale.
He's in there.
She whispered. "What do you mean?" I asked. She pointed, and then I saw it, Mr. Johnson's reflection. But it wasn't moving like it should have been. He stood still, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. I stepped closer, reaching out to touch the glass, but Mrs. Johnson grabbed my arm.
Don't,
She said sharply.
it's not a mirror. It's a door.
Her words sent a chill through me. The glass rippled faintly, like water disturbed by a pebble. As I stared, the whispers grew louder, turning into faint, distorted voices.
Help me.
One of them said. It sounded like Mr. Johnson. I took a step back. What is this place? Mrs. Johnson didn't answer. She was staring at the symbols on the walls, her hands trembling.
They're seals.
She muttered.
They keep it contained.
Keep what contained? I demanded. She didn't respond, but I didn't need her to. The mirror rippled again, and a shadow began to take shape on the other side. It wasn't Mr. Johnson. It was something else. Tall, thin, with two long limbs and hollow eyes that burned faintly. The whispers turned into a low, guttural growl. "We need to go," I said, grabbing her arm. "Now!" The shadow moved closer, pressing against the glass as if testing its boundaries. Cracks began to form along the surface, spiderwebbing out with a faint, almost musical sound. Mrs. Johnson hesitated, her eyes fixed on the mirror.
I can't leave him.
She said, tears streaming down her face. "You can't help him," I shouted. "If we don't leave now, we'll end up just like him." The cracks spread, and the growling grew louder. Finally, she let me pull her away, and we ran back up the staircase, the sound of shattering glass echoing behind us. We burst into the study, slamming the hidden door shut behind us. The house seemed darker now, the air heavier. The symbols were etched into the walls here too, glowing faintly, as though they were struggling to hold something back. "What was that?" I demanded, my voice shaking. Mrs. Johnson wiped her eyes.
I don't know.
She admitted.
We found the mirror when we moved in. It was locked away, sealed with those symbols. We should have left it alone.
"Why didn't you?" I asked. She didn't answer, but the guilt on her face told me everything I needed to know. I didn't sleep that night. The Johnsons left the next day, packing up their things and disappearing without a word. Their house stands empty now, but sometimes, late at night, I see lights flickering in the windows, and I hear faint whispers carried on the wind. And sometimes, when I look at my own reflection, I see cracks forming around the edges of the glass. When Mr. Walker moved in next door, no one paid much attention. He was quiet, unassuming, and polite, just the way people like their neighbors to be. He worked odd hours, often leaving at night and returning before dawn. No one questioned it. After all, we all have our quirks. But something about him didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way he avoided small talk, or how he always seemed to watch people out of the corner of his eye. Or perhaps it was the sounds, odd clinks and muffled thumps that echoed from his basement in the dead of night, unsettling and impossible to ignore. At first I told myself it wasn't my business, but then the disappearances started. The first was a stray dog. A large German shepherd that had wandered the neighborhood for weeks vanished one night. Then it was the neighborhood's eccentric handyman, Mr. Grayson. People assumed he'd moved on to another town, but his old truck was still parked on the street. The final straw came when my friend Sarah stopped by for coffee and mentioned her teenage brother had gone missing. He'd been walking home late one evening, just a few blocks from our houses, and no one had seen him since. Her story made my blood run cold. The last time I'd seen the boy, he was walking down the street right past Mr. Walker's house. That night I stayed up late, keeping an eye on Walker's house. Around midnight, the lights in his basement flickered on. Shadows moved behind the curtains, and the faint sound of metal scraping against stone carried through the night air. I grabbed a pair of binoculars, watching as Walker emerged from the basement. He was carrying something, a large, heavy bag that he threw into the back of his truck. My gut twisted. It was too big to be trash, too awkward to be anything ordinary. As he drove off, I made a decision. I was going to find out what was in that basement. The next day, I started watching him more closely. He left the house every evening at the same time, his truck loaded with whatever he'd been working on. I noticed he always locked the basement door behind him, double-checking it before leaving. That evening, I took a chance. As soon as his truck disappeared down the road, I slipped into his yard and tried the back door. Locked, of course. But the basement window wasn't. I hesitated, every part of me screaming that this was a bad idea. But something pushed me forward, a mix of fear, curiosity, and the need to know. The basement smelled of damp earth and oil. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long, flickering shadows across the walls. At first, everything seemed normal. Old tools, dusty shelves, a workbench covered in jars of screws and nails. But then I noticed the door at the back of the room. It was heavy and reinforced, with multiple locks. My stomach churned as I approached it. Beside the door was a small keyring, as if Walker hadn't expected anyone to get this far. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door and pushed it open. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was a makeshift operating theater. A metal table stood in the center, surrounded by trays of surgical tools that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars containing things that shouldn't have been removed from living beings. And then there were the cages. 3 of them, large enough to hold a person, sat against the far wall. 2 were empty, but the third held a young boy, Sarah's brother. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't speak, just stared at me, as if I were a hallucination. I rushed to the cage, fumbling with the lock. "It's okay," I whispered. "I'm getting you out of here." As I worked on the lock, the sound of an engine outside made my heart stop. Walker was back. Panic surged through me as I finally got the cage open. The boy stumbled out, his legs weak, but he clung to my arm. "Go," I hissed, shoving him toward the window. "Climb out and run. Get help."
"What about you?"
he asked, his voice hoarse. "Just go," I snapped. He hesitated, then nodded and scrambled out the window. I turned back to the room, my mind racing. If Walker found me here, I wouldn't get out alive. I needed to hide. The door slammed open, and Walker stepped inside. His eyes scanned the room, narrowing when he saw the empty cage.
I know you're here.
He called out, his voice calm but laced with menace.
You shouldn't have come.
I crouched behind a shelf, my breath shallow. He moved through the room slowly, his boots crunching against the floor. He carried something in his hand, a scalpel. its blade glinting under the fluorescent lights.
I just wanted to be left alone.
He muttered.
But you people can't mind your own business.
He was getting closer. My heart pounded as I scanned the room for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a heavy wrench lying on the workbench. Walker's shadow stretched across the shelf. I grabbed the wrench and swung as hard as I could. It connected with his arm, sending the scalpel clattering to the floor. He shouted in pain, spinning to face me. His expression twisted into something animalistic, his eyes filled with rage.
You shouldn't have done that.
I didn't wait for him to recover. I ran, dodging past him and bolting up the stairs. He was right behind me, his footsteps thundering on the wooden steps. I made it to the door, slamming it shut behind me and shoving a chair under the handle. By the time the police arrived, Walker was gone. The basement was empty, the operating room dismantled, as if it had never existed. But Sarah's brother had told them everything, and they believed him. The investigation revealed that Walker had been on the run for years, moving from town to town, luring people into his web before disappearing. No one knew exactly what he was doing with his victims, but the jars and the operating table painted a horrifying picture. Walker was never caught. Sometimes late at night I hear faint footsteps outside my window, and I wonder if he's still watching me, waiting for the right moment to return. Upon moving into my new house, it quickly became apparent that the neighbors on either side were as different as night and day, each exuding a distinct energy that couldn't have been more contrasting. On my left was Mrs. Lewis, a kind, elderly woman who welcomed me on the first day with a basket of freshly baked cookies. She had a warm smile, a neat garden overflowing with colorful flowers, and a habit of offering little tips about the neighborhood, like which grocery store had the best produce, or which day the garbage trucks actually arrived on time.
You're going to love it here,
she said one afternoon as we sat on her porch drinking tea.
Everyone is so friendly. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask.
On my right, however, was Mr. Grant. He was tall, brooding, and quiet. His house looked neglected, with overgrown weeds and a fence in desperate need of repair. The local kids whispered about him, calling him the lurker, and dared each other to knock on his door. At first, I avoided Mr. Grant. Who wouldn't, with all the rumors floating around? But Mrs. Lewis was different. We talked for hours on her porch, laughing about the weather or trading recipes. She seemed harmless, like a grandmother from a storybook. One afternoon, as I was trimming the hedges, Mr. Grant came over for the first time. His presence was imposing, his deep-set eyes scanning me like he was trying to solve a puzzle.
Hey,
he said gruffly. I stopped mid-snip and turned to him. Hi there, Mr. Grant. Need something? He hesitated, glancing toward Mrs. Lewis's house.
look, I know you're new here, but be careful around her.
I frowned, confused. Mrs. Lewis. Why? She's been nothing but nice to me. Grant shook his head.
That's what she wants you to think.
Come on, I said with a laugh. She's a sweet old lady. She makes cookies for the whole neighborhood. His expression hardened.
Sometimes the people who seem the sweetest are hiding the darkest secrets. Just keep your distance.
I rolled my eyes. You don't even talk to her. How would you know anything about her? He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me with those piercing eyes, before muttering,
Don't say I didn't warn you.
and walking away. That night, I couldn't shake what he'd said. It annoyed me how cryptic he was. What was his problem with her? But a small seed of doubt had been planted, and I started paying closer attention to Mrs. Lewis. I noticed she often left her house late at night, always wearing the same beige coat and carrying a large, heavy bag. She'd glance around nervously before getting into her car and driving off. Once, she saw me peeking through my window and waved with that same warm smile, but there was something behind her eyes, a flicker of something darker. The next morning, I casually brought it up during tea. I noticed you were out late last night. Midnight grocery run? I joked. Her smile didn't falter.
Oh, just dropping off some donations at the shelter. They always appreciate my casseroles.
It sounded plausible, perfectly innocent. But something about the way she said it felt rehearsed, like she'd had that answer ready. A few days later, I saw her in the backyard. She was digging near the flower bed, sweat glistening on her brow despite the cool weather. When I called out to her, she quickly stood, brushing dirt from her gloves.
Just planting some new tulips.
She said cheerfully, though I couldn't see any bulbs or gardening tools around. Later, when she wasn't home, I peeked over the fence. The patch she'd been working on wasn't a flower bed at all. It was freshly turned dirt, hastily covered with a thin layer of leaves. Something about it made my skin crawl. That same evening, Mr. Grant came over again, this time more insistent.
You're in danger,
He said, without preamble. Danger? I laughed nervously. From Mrs. Lewis? You've got to be kidding.
She's not what she seems.
He said, lowering his voice.
People go into that house and don't come out. You ever wonder why she's so eager to hand out cookies and tea? It's all part of her act.
Look, Mr. Grant, I said, crossing my arms. I get that you don't like her, but this is ridiculous.
Then explain why she leaves in the middle of the night.
He snapped. That stopped me. I wanted to deny it, but I couldn't. She said she's donating to shelters. I mumbled weakly. He let out a bitter laugh.
You really believe that? I've seen her dumping things in the woods. Big, heavy things. She thinks no one notices, but I do.
That night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow Mrs. Lewis. At exactly 11:30, her car pulled out of the driveway. I waited a few minutes before getting into my own car and trailing her, keeping my distance. She drove out of town and into the woods, stopping at a secluded clearing. I parked a safe distance away and crept closer, staying hidden behind the trees. Mrs. Lewis popped the trunk and hauled out a large black bag. She dragged it toward a shallow pit, her movements quick and methodical. My heart pounded as I realized the bag was roughly the size of a person. Before I could process what I was seeing, she turned suddenly, her eyes scanning the darkness. I held my breath, pressing myself against the tree. After a moment, she returned to her task, covering the bag with dirt and leaves before driving off. The next day, I couldn't shake what I'd seen in the woods. The image of Mrs. Lewis burying that heavy, ominous bag haunted me. I wanted to go to the police, but without proof. What could I say? That my sweet cookie-baking neighbor might be hiding bodies? They'd laugh me out of the station. I decided to confront Mr. Grant instead. After all, he seemed to know more than he was letting on. When I knocked on his door, he didn't answer at first. Just as I was about to leave, it creaked open, and he stood there, his face unreadable. "You need to tell me what's going on," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He sighed, opening the door wider and gesturing for me to come in. His house was as grim as I'd imagined, dimly lit, cluttered with old furniture, and heavy with the scent of mildew.
She's dangerous,
he said finally, sitting down in a worn armchair.
I've been watching her for years. People come and go, but some of them, they don't leave.
I told him about the bag in the woods, about her late-night trips, and the strange feeling I had whenever I was near her. His expression darkened.
You're not the first person she's lured in,
He said.
She picks her targets carefully. People no one will notice are missing. People she can manipulate. But you...
He paused, his eyes narrowing.
You're not like the others. She miscalculated with you.
What do you mean? I asked.
She underestimated you. That's why she hasn't made her move yet. She's waiting, trying to figure out what to do. But trust me, the longer you stay here, the more dangerous it gets.
His words left me uneasy, but I couldn't leave it alone. That night I decided to watch Mrs. Lewis more closely. I turned off all the lights in my house and sat by the window, peering into her yard. At exactly 11:30, her porch light flicked on. She stepped outside wearing her beige coat, a large bag slung over her shoulder. This time she wasn't heading to her car. She was walking toward the woods. I followed at a distance, careful to keep out of sight. She moved quickly, her steps deliberate, as if she'd done this 100 times before. When she reached the clearing, she set the bag down and began digging. But something was different this time. She wasn't alone. A man emerged from the shadows, tall and dressed in black. He spoke to her in hushed tones, and though I couldn't hear the words, their body language told me everything I needed to know. They were arguing. Mrs. Lewis gestured toward the bag, her movements sharp and agitated. The man shook his head, stepping closer to her. For a moment I thought he might grab her, but then she turned away, leaving the bag and walking back toward her house. The man stayed behind, watching her go before disappearing into the woods. The next morning, after pacing my living room for hours, I finally worked up the nerve to confront Mrs. Lewis. My heart was pounding as I crossed the lawn to her house. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting shifting patterns across the garden, which had begun to wilt without her usual care. I knocked on the door, and moments later, she opened it. Her warm smile greeted me as always, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that hadn't been there before.
Oh, hello, dear.
She said brightly.
Come in, you look troubled. Is everything all right?
I stepped inside, the familiar scent of lavender filling the air. The table was set as usual, tea steaming in delicate china cups. But I couldn't ignore the heaviness in the atmosphere. I need to talk to you, I said, my voice firmer than I expected.
Of course.
She replied, gesturing for me to sit.
Would you like some tea, or perhaps a cookie?
I ignored the offer and sat down across from her. She folded her hands neatly on the table, her expression one of practiced concern. I saw you last night, I said bluntly. Her smile didn't falter, but I noticed the slightest flicker in her eyes.
Oh?
She said lightly.
And what exactly did you see?
In the woods, I continued. With the bag, you were burying something. For a moment she said nothing. Then she let out a soft, musical laugh.
Oh dear, you must have misunderstood. I was simply clearing out some old gardening supplies. You know how heavy those bags of soil can get.
Gardening supplies, I repeated, incredulous. At midnight? In the middle of the woods? She tilted her head slightly, her smile unwavering.
The evening is so peaceful, don't you think? Sometimes it's the best time to get things done.
I leaned forward, my voice hardening. Mrs. Lewis, I know what I saw. That wasn't soil. What was in the bag? Her hands remained perfectly still, but her smile began to fade. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes cold and calculating.
You've always been such a curious one,
she said finally, her voice softer now, almost a whisper.
But curiosity is a dangerous habit, dear. Some questions are better left unanswered.
Stop dodging the question, I snapped. What was in the bag? Her expression shifted, the mask of sweetness slipping completely.
You think you know so much,
she said, her tone icy.
But you don't have the slightest idea what you're dealing with.
I felt a chill run down my spine. Tell me the truth, I demanded, my voice shaking. What's going on? She leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving mine.
Let me give you some advice,
she said, her voice calm, but laced with menace.
If you value your life, you'll stop asking questions. You'll forget what you think you saw, and you'll go back to your little house and live your quiet little life. Because if you don't...
She let the sentence hang in the air, her meaning unmistakable. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. You're hiding something, I said, my voice trembling with anger. And I'm going to find out what it is. Her smile returned, sharp and predatory.
Oh dear,
she said softly.
You've already found out too much, and now you've made yourself a problem.
I turned and walked out, her quiet laughter following me as I crossed the lawn back to my house. My chest felt tight, my mind racing. She wasn't just dangerous. She was in control. And for the first time, I realized I might be in over my head. I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. Mrs. Lewis's calm, predatory words echoed in my mind.
Curiosity can be dangerous, dear.
My instincts told me to stay away, but I couldn't. Not after everything I'd witnessed. That evening, as I sat in my living room trying to piece together what to do next, Mr. Grant knocked on my door. He looked frantic, his usual stoic demeanor replaced by urgency.
You need to leave,
He said without any preamble, his eyes darting nervously toward Mrs. Lewis's house. Why? I asked. What's going on?
She knows,
He said.
You confronted her, didn't you?
I hesitated. Yes, but...
You've made yourself a target.
He interrupted.
She doesn't let people walk away once they've seen too much. If you stay, you're putting yourself in danger.
I'm not running, I said firmly. She needs to be stopped. For a moment, he studied me, as if deciding whether or not to say more. Finally, he nodded.
All right. If you're serious about this, I need to show you something.
He led me into his house, which felt just as gloomy and suffocating as ever. On the dining table was a folder, thick with papers and photographs. He opened it and began spreading out its contents. There were photos of Mrs. Lewis in the woods, her freezer, and the man I'd seen her arguing with. But there were also detailed notes, addresses, dates, and even receipts. It was meticulous, the work of someone who had been keeping tabs on her for years.
She's been doing this for a long time,
He said, his voice low.
moving from town to town, luring people in and making them disappear. I've been watching her gathering evidence.
Why haven't you gone to the police? I asked.
She has connections,
He said grimly.
people in high places who protect her. If I'd gone to the police, they'd have buried it, and I'd have been next.
His explanation made sense, but something about it felt off. Why was he so invested in this? Why had he gone to such lengths to track her? As I flipped through the documents, something caught my eye. A property deed, signed by both Mrs. Lewis and Mr. Grant. My stomach twisted as I realized it wasn't the only one. There were contracts, business filings, and even shared bank transactions. What is this? I asked, my voice shaky. Grant froze. For the first time, his mask slipped, and I saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes.
I didn't know what she was at first,
He said quietly.
We were partners. She had the charm, the connections. I handled the logistics, but I didn't know how far she'd gone until it was too late.
You're her accomplice, I said, my voice rising.
Not anymore.
He snapped.
Do you think I don't know what's coming? She's become reckless and people are starting to ask questions. If they come for her, they'll come for me too.
So you're using me, I said, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. You're trying to pin this all on her. He didn't deny it.
She's the one who's been doing the dirty work. She's the face they'll recognize. If you can give them enough to focus on her, I can disappear before it all comes crashing down.
I stared at him, my mind racing. He had manipulated me, feeding me just enough truth to set me on a collision course with Mrs. Lewis while keeping himself in the shadows. Why should I help you? I demanded.
Because you don't have a choice,
He said coldly.
If you don't, she'll come after you. And trust me, you won't survive that.
That night, I didn't sleep. How could I? Every creak in my house, every shadow cast by the streetlights outside, felt like a threat. Mrs. Lewis's voice echoed in my mind.
Curiosity can be dangerous, dear.
And then there was Mr. Grant, with his cryptic warnings and urgent insistence to leave. I was caught between two monsters, each with their own secrets, each dragging me deeper into their darkness. What scared me most was that I didn't know who was worse. By morning, my decision was made. I gathered every shred of evidence I had, photos, notes, everything, and anonymously sent it to the authorities. I made sure it all pointed to Mrs. Lewis. If one of them had to go down, it would be her. A week passed, and then she was gone. No warning, no goodbyes. Her house, once so inviting, stood eerily quiet, her garden beginning to wilt from neglect. But just days after her disappearance, Mr. Grant vanished too. His house, already grim and foreboding, now felt like a tomb. The windows were dark, the yard overgrown, and the silence was almost oppressive. For a while I thought it was over. I tried to convince myself that I had done the right thing, that I was free of them. Months later, while scrolling through the news, a headline stopped me cold. Warehouse fire uncovers evidence of criminal network. My hands trembled as I clicked on the article. Investigators had found human remains, counterfeit documents, and other horrifying evidence linking the property to both Mrs. Lewis and Mr. Grant. The report detailed how they had worked together for years, luring people in, exploiting them, and discarding them when they were no longer useful. But the most chilling part? The fire wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, a clear message from someone they had crossed. The article included no suspects, just speculation that the two had finally fallen victim to the same darkness they had unleashed on others. I should have felt relief. They were gone, both of them. Their web of lies and manipulation had collapsed. But instead I felt a gnawing sense of dread. That evening, as I sat in my living room, I thought about the fire. Who had done it? Was it one of their victims? Someone else in their network? Or something darker? As the question swirled in my mind, a soft knock echoed from my front door. My chest tightened as I approached, cautiously peeking through the peephole. No one was there. When I opened the door, I found a single item lying on the doorstep. A cookie, perfectly round and neatly placed on a napkin. My stomach dropped. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my pulse racing. It had to be a coincidence, right? A prank? But deep down, I knew better. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. I avoided the abandoned houses on either side of mine, but their presence loomed over me like a shadow. One night, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched, I decided to visit Mrs. Lewis's house. Maybe it was a mistake, but I had to know if there was anything left, any clue, any explanation. Her house was eerily quiet, the door unlocked. Inside, the air felt heavy, the faint scent of lavender still lingering. Her furniture was untouched, her kitchen table still set, as if waiting for someone to join her for tea. But then I noticed something that sent chills down my spine. On the kitchen counter was a folder, the same kind Mr. Grant had shown me. Inside were papers, photos, and notes, but these weren't about Mrs. Lewis. They were about him. The photos showed Mr. Grant meeting with people in dark alleys, exchanging envelopes and packages. The notes detailed transactions, locations, and dates that matched the news reports about the warehouse fire. And then there was a single piece of paper, handwritten in neat, deliberate letters. "You were right about him." My hands shook as I put the folder down. She had known. She had planned this. Somehow, she had turned the tables on him just as he had tried to do to her. I left the house in a daze, my mind reeling. The next morning, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On my porch, neatly placed on the railing, was another cookie. This time there was no napkin, just the cookie, sitting there as if waiting for me. Months passed, and I tried to move on. I avoided the news, the neighborhood, everything that reminded me of them. But late at night, I still heard their voices. Mrs. Lewis's soft laugh, her cryptic warnings, Mr. Grant's gruff tone, his urgency, and then came the whispers. At first I thought it was my imagination, but they grew louder, more distinct.
Curiosity can be dangerous, dear. You'll see.
One evening, as I sat in my darkened living room, I saw a figure standing outside my window, tall, brooding. Mr. Grant? No, it couldn't be. He was gone. But then another figure appeared, smaller, with a warm smile. Mrs. Lewis. They stood there together, side by side, watching me. I blinked, and they were gone. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. Please hit follow to support the channel, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next video. See you soon, and goodbye.